Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. They want to speak up a little bit louder, Jen. You might want to speak up louder. Oh, okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, nice. Do you want to share the screen? Sure.
Yeah. How do I do this?
Yes, you can mouse down to the Hey people, we're gonna start the seminar now. Hello, we're starting the seminar now. Hello everyone, on Zoom and in person. Welcome to the IOB seminar. My name is Chen Xie. I have the honor to introduce today's virtual speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Perkel, technology editor at Nature. I first came across Dr. Perkel's writing while struggling with reproducibility in my own research. In fact, the only thing that is reproducible in my workflow is getting different results every time I run the same pipeline. These articles, especially those reporting the diverse efforts across the scientific community to tackle reproducibility challenges, have been insightful and encouraging, especially for beginners. Dr. Perkel holds a PhD in cell and molecular biology from the University of Pennsylvania, and his writing is known for covering cutting-edge methods in computational biology and bioinformatics, making complex technology accessible and relevant for researchers. Let's welcome Dr. Jeffrey Perkel.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you, Chen. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all today. Um, so, um, I wanted to tell you a little bit about me. Chen just gave you a brief bio, but just to say, so as he said, I have a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, but I'm definitely not a bioinformatician, nor am I in any way a trained programmer. um, but I've always been interested in programming. But I've had no formal training. I've never taken a computer science course. But when I was a doctoral student in cell and molecular biology, the University of Pennsylvania started um, a program, a master's program in bioinformatics, and I actually looked into transferring. I ultimately decided not to for a variety of reasons, but I mean, I've always been sort of interested in this intersection of biology and computing. And years later, as a freelance writer, I was working on a feature on the Python programming language in science. And as part of my work writing that article or researching that article, I took the opportunity to try and learn a little bit about the language and really enjoyed it. Then later I tried to teach myself R because of its role in bioinformatics and both just in terms of learning, but also because I wanted to be able to do some things with the spreadsheets that I was working with in my job. And I enjoyed that. And as a result, I kind of made it a practice as I worked on articles in the future to try and not just write about tools that I was interested in, but to learn about them a little bit. And if possible, to develop examples that, nature's readers could maybe work through to make this content a little bit more accessible. Um, for instance, with the command line environment called Bash. Um, but whatever tool or language I was working with, one recurring theme that has come up over and over again in my section and in my own reporting has been computational reproducibility. Um, so why should we focus on computational reproducibility? So there's this in my job when I talk to people, typically I'm talking to people and they describe themselves as either being a wet lab or a dry lab. A wet lab being one that does, um, actual physical experiments, and a dry lab being one that does computation. Um, and obviously, those two types of labs and skill sets are different, but computation is fundamentally a scientific method like any other, and reproducibility is an essential aspect of any science. If you're doing, when you're doing DNA analysis, you need to do it more than once, and it's the same thing when you're doing computation. So ensuring that your methods are reproducible, I mean, if you can do the same thing more than once, it gives you confidence in your results. It allows others to build off your findings. It makes it easier to come back to a project 6 months later or years later. It makes it easier for others to review your work, makes it easier for them to collaborate with you. And kind of long story short, it makes your work more impactful, basically. So in 2019, a the editors of a journal called Rescience C um, announced this thing called the 10-year reproducibility challenge, which was basically they were like throwing down the gauntlet, asking researchers who did computational research to try and basically replicate results that they had published 10 or more years earlier. Um, the journal would publish their reports, their reproducibility attempts, and they invited people to Bordeaux, France, to basically have a meeting, a workshop, where people discussed what it was that they were going to learn. And I thought this would be a really fun thing I learned about this. I thought it sounded fascinating, something that my section was very much interested in. I got permission to go to it, and woohoo, I'm going to France. Um, and Like I said, this was in 2019. Unfortunately, the conference was supposed to be in the summer of 2020, and things happened between 2019 and 2020 that kind of killed those plans. Um, so I was sad. Um, but they did ultimately. Um, so the meeting was canceled, but people did still submit their reproducibility reports, and I was able to speak to a number of these researchers about their experience. So, like, here's one from Conrad Hinson, who was one of the organizers of the event. And basically, Conrad was trying to reproduce a project that had been done in between 1992 and 1994 using the language Fortran 77. And this is just a screenshot or a screen capture of part of the PDF. But basically, what he's saying here is he found his code. He found his code. The code probably would have worked, or he could still execute Fortran 77 code, but the code was on a tape, was on magnetic tapes that he no longer had a reader for. So even though he had thought ahead and made backups and everything, he now 20 something years later no longer had a way to actually open those files. Another report talked about um, a researcher trying to model electronic device called a Josephson junction using Fortran, but they used Visual Basic to do the data analysis. And as you can imagine, in 2000 or 2019 or 2020, trying to run Visual Basic was a bit of a problem. As the author had pointed out in his reproducibility report, Visual Basic no longer exists. There is a variant of it now, but it shares only the name. It's completely incompatible. Um, so this researcher had to try and rebuild a DOS 6.2 Windows 3.1 system on an emulator, which he sent us this screenshot here showing Visual Basic running on what looks like a Mac. Um, and then a third example um, here from Carl Broman at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He tried to reproduce a study that had been published in 2003, and the code was a mix of R and C. He could find the code, but he couldn't remember how it was organized, or it wasn't particularly well documented. He didn't understand the organization system that he used, and so it was a little more challenging than it should have been to actually to easily reproduce the code that he had published all those years earlier. So unfortunately, I was never able to make it to Bordeaux, but I was able to write this fun feature about the challenge and this very fun illustration from the Project Twins, that is an illustration company we often use. Um, but through this experience and through some of the other articles that I've written and that I've edited, I've come up with a couple of I've learned some lessons that I think are useful for anybody about the importance of computational reproducibility. The first involves spreadsheets. So um, so spreadsheets are among the easiest and best ways to input data into a computer. It's easier to type something into a spreadsheet than it is to, say, try to write a CSV file directly. But researchers, obviously, especially bioinformaticians who are used to working at the command line, don't particularly like to use spreadsheets. Um, in one article that we published, this researcher named Janina Saibene basically pointed out that scientists like to say spreadsheets aren't particularly useful. That's not true, but they do have to be used. They do have to be used with care. And so, what does that mean? Well, so I found this very funny comic that pokes fun at a very annoying feature of Microsoft Excel, right? So you have a glass, and the pessimist says the glass is half empty, and the optimist says the glass is half full, and Excel thinks that the glass is February 1st because it converts one half into a date. Um, and that's funny. It makes for a funny cartoon, but for scientists, that kind of behavior can have real uh, impact. Um, um, this kind of auto formatting, converting a fraction into a date, can corrupt your data, especially if you don't realize it's happening. Um, so gene symbols, especially, can be problematic in this way because gene symbols like Sept4 and March 1, if you're not paying attention and you open it in a spreadsheet, can automatically be changed to like 4sep and 1mar, and that will ruin your data. And there are hundreds and hundreds of papers um, in the literature that people have looked at and found that they have this kind of auto formatting error in the supplementary information. Um, Other problems are, cell to cell dependencies are not obvious. There are ways to get around it, but you have to kind of go out of your way to find them. Um, cells that appear empty may not really be empty. Formula ranges may be incorrect. And most importantly, um, cell formatting, which makes the spreadsheet look good, will be lost or can very easily be lost when you export the data in a way to make it to analyze it. So so through articles that I've written and edited, I have here, I mean, there are some ways to use a spreadsheet properly. I've listed five here. You know, if you have your raw data in a spreadsheet, then keep your raw data raw, which means, just copy the file, lock it, and never open it again. So at least if something gets messed up, you can always go back to the original. Make your data machine readable, which means, one row of column titles, no merge cells, one table per page. Um, be consistent, however you're going to do it. How are you going to indicate no data? Is it NA, N/A? Is it going to be blank? What date format will you use? Um, what format are you going to use for GPS coordinates? Document your work and cross-check your data. If you have 1,000 rows, then you should, in your analysis, you should have 1,000 rows when you do your when you crunch your numbers. Um, there is a really wonderful uh, review article written in 2018 by Carl Broman, who also participated in that 10 years reproducibility challenge about data organization and spreadsheets. This is a great read for anybody who might be using spreadsheets in their science for how to use them correctly. Um, so that's tip number one. Tip number two, which I don't think I need to tell this audience exactly, but obviously embrace code. Um, anything that you do that involves point and click interfaces is inherently irreproducible. Um, so using scripting or coding, whatever that looks like for you, it's reproducible, it's documented, it's inherently documented. You can version control it, you can share it, you can automate it with the appropriate tools. Usually, at least when it comes to Python and R and C, they're open source and open access. And if you use something like a workflow system, they can be pretty smart. Like a workflow system, for instance, allows you to only execute that parts of your workflow that have only execute those parts of the workflow that have changed, for instance. So you can save computational time, for instance, if you're doing something extensive, computationally intensive. Um, computational notebooks are a great thing to use. I don't know if this is something you've seen in your classes, but computational notebooks are a popular way to interleave code, result, and explanatory text in a single document, um, such as the image on the left there. They look pretty good. You can turn them into web pages and PDFs and things like that. Um, they're also incredibly popular. The graph on the right is from GitHub's State of the Octaverse report that they publish every year. This is the most recent report. You can see the usage of this file format on GitHub. It's a very, very popular way to show data, to present data rather. And it has many, many advantages, and people generally speaking love them. That said, notebooks have problems of their own. There was a very famous or a very widely viewed video on GitHub, sorry, on YouTube, from a programmer named Joel Gruz, um, from the JupyterCon conference several years ago, called "I Don't Like Notebooks," in which he explains that notebooks are great, but they can be used in ways that promote poor programming practice. The biggest problem with them is that it's possible to run cells out of order so that you end up in having what's called a state problem where where your computational environment, the variables in memory, don't match the text in your browser, and then you as a programmer or your readers can get very confused as to what's happening. And so there's this kind of shorthand that people sometimes say, restart and run all, or it didn't happen, which simply means if you're getting to a point where something seems to be working, it's a good idea to clear your environment and run it again just to make sure you've captured how you got to the results you want. Newer notebooks, which are reactive and interactive, can alleviate state problems. These are notebooks that act a little bit like a spreadsheet, um, where basically the cells understand their relationship to one another. And so if you change um, a cell, for instance, that has a variable, and a different cell uses that variable, they know to automatically update, which you can see in this little GIF on the right. As the user moves that slider, the uh, the calculation in the second cell, or the third cell rather, updates. So these kinds of notebooks have different problems, but at the very least, they never have state problems. So, this is one way to get around the difficulties some people have with computational notebooks. And there's a number of these platforms now, including Observable, which is kind of a JavaScript-based platform, and Marimo, which is Python and JavaScript, actually. This GIF is from Marimo. Um, Another thing that you can do that I really like is to use inline computation. So if you're writing a manuscript based on your computations, the traditional way of doing that is, you do your calculations, your computations, and then when you go to write your article, you type them in. You type in the numbers, or you copy and paste an image. Um, so you look back at your notes and you're like, oh, I use this version of this tool and I had this many rows in my database. Um, and that's fine as long as you always remember to update those things when they change. The problem is it's easy to forget to do that. So computational notebook systems and computational publishing systems like This Is Our Studio, they allow you to perform inline computation as text is rendered into a final format. So what you're seeing in this image here is on the left is code, and or sorry, is text interspersed with code, and the text in purple is inline computations that on the right are rendered in bold. So you can see, for instance, rather than typing the time or the date when this document was rendered, it's inserted automatically in the text as the document renders. And so, um, as long as your computation itself is correct, your rendered document will always be accurate. Um, so this is a clever trick, especially if you're doing something like writing a thesis. Um, and you want to make sure that as you make last minute changes to your chapters that you don't inadvertently insert an error. Um, a fifth lesson I've learned is about computational environments. So you want to control the environment you're working in. Um, the thing about the thing about scientific computing is that we all use, or everyone's using, these open source software pieces like the tidyverse in R, and scikit-learn in Python, and all of these libraries, and we're building on top of them. The problem is that with all of these pieces being depending on one another, um, and people changing them at different times and in different ways, and without consulting one another, obviously, if your tool relies upon another tool and that tool changes in some way, you can end up with code that, through no fault of your own, suddenly breaks, or worse, changes your results without you realizing it. Um, so think about, for instance, the change between Python 2 and Python 3. In Python 2, print was a directive. So the code print hello world, like I've written there without parentheses, was valid code in Python 2. You could put hello world in parentheses, but this syntax was allowed. But Python 3 does not allow this syntax. So if you wrote your code like this, and then the user of your code updated from Python 2 to Python 3, the code that you had written would suddenly no longer work. And that person would have to know how to fix it, or you would have to know how to fix it. Um, so this is basically a recurring problem when so much of the computational scientific computing stack is open source and under constant development. So the way to get around that is to basically control your environment. Um, so this frees you, both the user and the programmer, from having to deal with dependencies and compilation problems, installation. It ensures consistent execution from experiment to experiment and over time. And if you change your computer, these things will always, well, ideally will always be the same. You can automate you can automate things like where you download your data from. It facilitates collaboration. You can just share your environment with somebody else. And there's different degrees of these kinds of tools. They can be easy or complex. You can use cloud-based systems like Google Colab or Binder. You can set up virtual environments on your computer, like using Conda. You can build something much more complicated, like a Docker container. They all achieve, they all work towards the same goal. They are obviously easier or harder to do and easier or harder to use. But the point is, by thinking about this and by thinking about the environment in which you're running your code, you can make your life, your future use life, and your users' life or your collaborators' lives easier. Um, Lesson six, get comfortable with version control or get comfortable with Git. I like this t-shirt, Git, push, pray. Basically, you just need to use version control if you're going to be using code. It allows you to see when you made changes, when, and ideally you document why you've made changes. You can roll them back if you suddenly realize you've inserted some sort of bug. And they basically they document provenance of your computational work. This graph on the right basically shows how the use of the search term GitHub has changed in PubMed over time. You can see it's becoming increasingly popular for people to post their data and their code on the code sharing site GitHub. Um, Number seven is to start early. Whatever you're going to do, do it early. Don't do it as a last minute thing at the end of your experiments. Um, Figure out your environment, lock it down, figure out how you're going to do your processes, like how you're going to collect your data, how you're going to record your data. All of these things, do it early and then stick with it. Because otherwise, you have to kind of work backwards and figure out what you did after the fact. And that's really, really difficult. Um, and number eight, um, don't worry about trying to do everything. There is a spectrum of processes or behaviors that are included under the umbrella of computational reproducibility. Everything from, like I said, bash scripts to Docker containers to code sharing to version control. Not everything is feasible or practical for everybody. You need to be able to work with your collaborators, and your collaborators may not feel comfortable with version control. Um, but do what you can. Basically, anything that you can do is better than nothing. And if you do nothing else but release your source code, for instance, that goes a long way because other people can look at your code and try and figure out what you've done. Um, the more you can do, the better, but don't worry about trying to do everything because unfortunately, academia doesn't really incentivize um, reproducibility, reproducibility work. You don't get tenure points for putting things on GitHub usually, or sharing them on Zenodo. Um, and the last bit of um, advice I would offer is when you've done all of these things and you think you're doing everything you can to make your code or your research reproducible, test yourself. Um, this is a screenshot from a website called ReproHacks. Basically, ReproHacks are these webinars, or these seminars rather, where they ask researchers to submit papers that they believe are computationally reproducible. And then they invite people to test it, download the code, download the data, and see, can they reproduce your environment? Can they reproduce your results? Can they get the same graphs that you got? Um, and remarkably, given the fact that, like the people who do this obviously are interested in reproducibility, they're not just talking about it, they're actually thinking about it and taking proactive steps. Still, many times the woman the researcher who runs these programs told me it fails because it's really, really hard to get this right. To make sure that the environment you have on your computer can be replicated on somebody else's computer and that they can, download the data and set up the environment correctly and all of these things so that other people can run it in exactly the same way. So those are 9 lessons that I have kind of learned through the course of my reporting and my editing over the past couple of years. Some of them are pretty obvious, I suppose, and some of them, still surprise me. I still struggle with all of these. It's very easy to say that you want to do these things. Actually doing them and doing them in a way that's methodical can be challenging. Um, but as a final thing, I wanted to show you um, uh, one final collection of advice that we published in one of the articles from my section um, about reproducibility. Just sort of summed up some of these take-home messages. So again, use code, don't use point and click interfaces. Um, Document your work with comments, computational notebooks. Use a README file to explain how to set up your environment, or if you need to set a random seed, a seed for your random number generator, make sure you write down what seed you used, so that you can go back to it. Expected parameters, what the variables mean. Um, uh, create test functions. Make sure that the algorithm that underlies whatever you're doing isn't changing your results aren't changing as you update your work. Um, Create some sort of master script that shows other people how to get into your code. Like a run me file that downloads the data sets you need, sets variables, creates you know, starts the workflow, whatever is appropriate for your work. Um, Archive your code, not on GitHub. GitHub is great, but GitHub is impermanent, and anyone can go in and delete something. So put things on GitHub, but then also put them on archiving services like Zenodo and Figshare. Use version control. Um, Note which particular version of the code you use to create a particular result, so you can, go back if you have to. Um, Create your document your environment. Create a Docker container or a Conda environment and make note of what's in it. Use continuous integration if you have to, or if you can rather, so that your code runs automatically, and make sure that tests run every time you update so you know if something is breaking. Um, Try to avoid niche libraries that may in future years not keep up with your changes and may one day break your code. And finally, make sure that your code works in somebody else's hand, that somebody else is able to replicate your environment and replicate your results. Um, I realized that I went through that very, very quickly. And like I said, I am not the expert that all of you are, but these are things that have helped me over the years as I've tried to do my work as a burgeoning data journalist. Um, and thank you so much for listening to me. And I'll take any questions. Sorry, I went through that very, very quickly.
That was so good. Sorry, we were just trying to figure out how to unmute ourselves in the room. I think people can, I see some questions in the chat. Nathan, do you want to speak up? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask that by yourself?
Yeah, sure. I don't have the best microphone, so hopefully you can understand me. I was just gonna ask specifically for like Conda, so Salinity, and then like Singularity, and then like Docker. Do you know any good resources to learn that stuff? Because I'm a big Conda enthusiast, but when I see Docker, I cry a little bit. So, uh,
Yeah, Conda is really hard. I mean, sorry, Docker is really hard. And Docker also presents problems because you need to have certain permissions on your computer. So if it's your own computer, it's not usually a problem. But like if you work at a company, um, or if you're using any sort of managed computer, you may not have the permissions to use Docker, but you usually can use Singularity, which I believe is compatible with Docker. Um, do I know any resources? Um, I would say a good place. Well, I would say a good place to look actually is the Carpentries, which is a. I should have had a slide on that. I apologize. The Carpentries is this organization that runs 1 or 2 day webinar or seminars rather with researchers about um, uh, data science, computational methods, and things of that nature. They come to your school. They basically run through like how to set up your environments, how to, the basics of the command line, the basics of Python. And and all of their materials are open source and online. They may very well have lessons on this. My experience is that if you don't know how to do something, you can usually ask somebody, like find somebody who's written about this, and just ask them. People are pretty helpful. I'm certain that there are like Docker tutorials. I tried to use Docker once. I could not get it set up without help. But like I said, it wasn't hard to find that help. So that would be my advice.
awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, do you want to ask the next question?
Hi, I'm Turjo. So I was wondering, with all these LLMs and AI-based tools that we're seeing nowadays, and that's also getting integrated in the bioinformatics tools that we're using, are those really reproducible in the longer run? Because the way they evolve as a algorithm.
I see. So in other words, if you ask it a question, will it give you the same answer tomorrow? Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes, kind of that way. So
I mean, I think the short answer to that is maybe, maybe. It depends on your question, obviously, and how often it's seen it. I mean, I don't personally use AI, so I can't. Like code helpers. So I can't answer that question directly. Um, I will say if you are using them, and I know a lot of people do, and they have a lot of benefits. I mean, basically, as long as you save what you've created, what it's created, and document it and version control it, you can always go back to it, um, and pick up from where you left off. But usually there's more than one way to solve a problem, and it's certainly possible that if you ask an LLM the same question twice, it will give you two different answers. Um, so, I mean, that's a very good question, how AI fits into computational reproducibility. I think the short answer is find a solution that appears to work for you, test it like crazy because, LLMs make mistakes, make sure that the edge cases work the way you expect them to. If you're expecting a loop to count 100 times, make sure it really is counting 100 times, not 99 or 101. And then kind of lock it down with like version control. So you say, my LLM gave me this. This is what I'm going with. And then get out of the AI, if you know what I mean.
That sounds great. I personally love AI and I use a lot of LLM-based tools to help me code. And I think the current status is that it's easy to get wrong on the logic part. as long as you check it, then that is fine. And on the other hand, the problem is the security issue. It might push your API to GitHub, and that is not good. But other than that, it will usually choose the best and most efficient algorithm for your task. So I actually think it's very worth trying. But
I've heard it's very useful for and uncontroversially very useful for like rote things. Like you can't remember the exact syntax to create a ggplot that looks a particular way. Like Copilot's really good at, I hear, really good at that sort of thing, or matplotlib. But I would be hesitant. Well, I would certainly be hesitant to rely on it. You can certainly use it to get I mean, this is just my own personal opinion. I would certainly have no problem imagining it being useful to ask it for help, but then you need to spend a lot of time making sure that what it tells you is correct. So,
since I don't see the next question yet, I'll ask another one. That is, could you share something about your day-to-day life as a data journalist or a technology editor? How much time do you read news things? Do you need to interview new people? Does that work?
um, well, I mean, as an editor, I'm constantly looking for story ideas and trying out new tools to see what they do and what they can do and what they can't. Um, and so I spend a lot of my day reading the literature, just trying things out, seeing what people are talking about on social media, like what problems scientists are talking about on social media, what they're writing about in preprint archives like Archive and bioRxiv, um, things of this nature. I mean, obviously, when I have an article in production, I'm also obviously actively editing, going through that process, looking for art. The interesting thing about my job is that, I mean, every day is different, but I will say that I have found the skill to be able to work with data immeasurably helpful because it's really not a skill. I mean, maybe it's a skill. I mean, obviously it's a skill they teach now, but when I was in school, it was not something that they really focused on. It was sort of assumed that you knew how to use a spreadsheet, but certainly nobody was teaching you how to program unless you took a course in it on your own. And it's amazing how easy it is to use a spreadsheet wrong. One of the researchers I spoke to for one article I worked on was telling me that she was trying to do some data analysis with an Excel spreadsheet that she had imported into R, and there was a particular column that she couldn't figure out what these values meant. There were these random letters. I mean, some of the cells had values that made sense, and some of them just had random letters. And eventually, she figured out that what the person who had created the original spreadsheet, had done was basically just written like no data vertically, like NODA, one in each cell vertically, which makes sense if you're looking at the spreadsheet on your screen, but of course is completely lost to a data analyst. And I mean, I'm sure that when I was in grad school, I did things like that too. It's only by learning about this kind of process that or how this data is analyzed and what these tools can and cannot do that you realize it's very easy to make a mistake. And again, there's nothing wrong with using a cell coloring, for instance, cell formatting in a spreadsheet. But if you're using that formatting to hold data, like, using color, like using green and red to indicate whether or not you're going to move certain numbers forward, certain rows forward, and you don't also have that in a column of its own, you can lose that data when you export it as a C. You will lose that data when you export it as a CSV.
Yeah, that sounds so fair that you are emphasizing what to do and what not to do, but also acknowledging that we probably all did that at some point, but that's okay as long as we know how to improve. Turja, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I actually had another thing to ask you about. you mentioned during your presentation that there is not a lot of incentive to do no, do code reproducibility, but like as you are involved in with the publishing world, there is a lot of emphasis on data reproducibility and also data storage, like at least as a supplementary information, if not stored as Excel files in other places. But how can publishing companies or these journals put forward this emphasis on code reproducibility? What are your suggestions on that?
Um, that's a really good question. I don't know. Fortunately, it's not my job to make those decisions. Um, what I meant when I said there's no incentive, what I meant was, journals insist, or many journals insist that you deposit your code, you deposit your data. Um, but what exactly, like the minimum standard for computational reproducibility should be, I mean, nobody's really decided on that, right? Like, is it enough to put your code on GitHub? Should you put it in Zenodo? What format it should be. I should have mentioned this actually, but like putting something in an open source format like CSV is better than putting it in an Excel format because, well, I mean, most people, I mean, I think there are free readers for Excel files, but if you put your data online in a proprietary file format, it can lock some people out. Some people may not be able to open those files, right? Um, or read those files. Um, So these are things that you have to do, like if you're going to publish a computationally intensive paper, but but you don't get like academic points for them, is what I meant. Like um, spending a lot of time building reproducibility infrastructure helps you, but you don't like it doesn't advance your tenure package to do it. I mean, it does in the sense that your work is better. It might have a better shot at being published. You might get more citations and more collaborations. And in that sense, it helps you. But in the just like, is this a thing that academia um, considers important? Oh, sorry, the tenure committees think is important. The answer is kind of, so it's that's what I meant. I know a lot of journals really struggle with how to walk this line because you could simply ask for everything, but people cannot accommodate you. I mean, not everybody can make, as that one questioner asked or pointed out earlier, it's really hard to make a Docker file. It takes some expertise. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody has the permission to do it. Um, and so on and so forth. So, um, it's something that I think everyone struggles with, really, which is why sort of doing what you can, I think, is sort of enough. You know, you have to make time for you have to make time for yourself. You want to do your science, not spend your life focusing on making sure everything is reproducible. You need to find a balance.
Sounds great. And I think oh, plenty. Okay, Nikita had the next question. You want to speak up?
Sure. Hi. When you work on a technical piece, what is your process for making it more accessible and not dogmatic? Because when I try to write, I write with a lot of jargon, and I don't know how to write without jargon. I just wanted to know your process on trying to make the piece more clear and accessible.
That's a really good question. I think, I mean, basically, self-awareness is really, really, I mean, you clearly are recognizing that you use jargon. It's really kind of a challenge to think about, to distill things down to what you need to say and what you don't, while maintaining, while keeping what you say not so general as to be useless. Um, I guess I mean, for one thing, I've been doing this for a long time, and so it's a little bit second nature, but I mean, I definitely still get caught out inserting jargon into things. I mean, we all do. Um, I think the best way to do it is basically get the word, like my process, I suppose, is get the words on the page, then go back through and try to figure out how to polish it. So it's fine to use jargon in your first draft and your second draft, but as you're going through it, you can look at it and say, is there like, do I have to use jargon here? Can I simplify this point? Can I use, I mean, if it's not per se scientific writing, like is there a metaphor or analogy you can use? Um, do you need all of these details? Um, um, Things like that. And very often you find that you don't. You can, a lot of things can be cut. I mean, but some things just, sometimes there's just literally no other way to say something. And then you have to use the jargon, but then maybe define it a little bit. Um, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. Because I just wanted to know what processes you use to catch yourself when you use jargon. Because I have tried to use ChatGPT and it does give me reviews about like I am using too much technical jargon. I was wondering if you had any other tools that you do use to catch yourself doing when you do that.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah, I'm definitely not using, yeah, um, I know a lot of people use ChatGPT to help with their writing for a variety of reasons. I don't personally do that. But I would imagine simply saying to it, can you say this in a more accessible way? Or being rather than saying open-ended, like more accessible, you can say, my understanding is, I should say, I don't use chatbots. My understanding is that if you prompt it well, you can avoid things like that. Like, I want to write for an audience of X. Like I want this to be accessible to high school seniors. Um, Please make sure that my text matches that audience. Would probably go a long way towards fixing that.
Thank you.
Any more questions in the room and on Zoom? Not. I think that is a great talk, and thanks for everyone participating. Thank you, Dr. Perkel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a huge pleasure.
You.